Well, thank you very much, and greetings from Birmingham. To say a little bit more about myself, only briefly, those of you who know Birmingham will know it is one of the larger metropolitan cities in our country, and also one of the most diverse. And it won't be long before it is a majority-minority city, where the minority ethnic groups make up the majority of the population. I've also worked with refugees and asylum seekers very closely now in various capacities for over 10 years. So know a lot of individual stories, as well as having to address some of the political and policy issues as well from a faith perspective. And finally, I was recently invited by the Bishop of Birmingham to join his interfaith task group because of my many years of working alongside particularly Muslim scholars and faith leaders in Birmingham and elsewhere in Britain to help and to advocate for tolerance, acceptance and understanding. This afternoon, the panels are going to be looking at the challenging ISIS ideology, and secondly, building trust through improved responses to extremism and xenophobia. So we're looking at ideologies and their consequences. And for me, it seems ideologies evolve and adapt, or they wither and die. However, extreme ideologies are coercive and confrontational, and left unchallenged, lead to political extremism of the most reactionary kind. The battle of ideas taken to extremes becomes conflict and poses an existential threat to all of its opponents. Religious political extremism is of a different sort, especially those that have theistic roots, because they add claims of God to their cause and a mantle of righteousness to their adherents. And we don't have to look only at the ideology of ISIS for this. I can give you two examples, one from British history, English history, and one from America. We had our own civil war, which had a very strong element of righteous warfare about it. And I would go as far as to say that elements of the American civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s also had dimensions of this religio-political extremism underlying it, and the consequences thereof were both coercive, confrontational, and bloody and violent. It was once said that the first casualty of war is truth, whether you believe that was Senator Johnson from America in 1918 or Aeschylus, the Greek tragedy writer. It's become something we all tend to quote at times of conflict. I'd like to add that the first casualty of a religious war, or with a war with strong and significant religious dimensions, is the truth about religion itself. And this is because one of the challenges that people of religious faith like myself have to cope with is the accusations and hostility towards us because we're seen as representing a superstitious or backward-looking ideology ourselves, which has led to extremism, violence, and the effects that we're seeing in parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. So religion is to blame. Religion causes violence. Religion causes enmity. And those of us who know our religion well and our adherents and have given our lives to our beliefs know that that is not true, and yet we have to counter it in ways which are persuasive and authentic and come from our own witness to the truth. So, I hope this afternoon we will find ways of pursuing the truth about the causes of ideologies like ISIS, and see how perhaps religion is not just part of the problem, but can be part of the solution. Thank you.
So I'm Deborah Pout. I'm going to be chairing this session on challenging ISIS ideology. And in the past few days, those of you who've been present, we've been talking how there's been agreement that ISIS will be militarily defeated. But that doesn't mean that the ideological battle is over. And that battle for hearts and minds is as vital as the military battle. And we've also heard from experts that they're predicting that ISIS will go underground and use other forms of terrorism, and they aren't going to disappear. So this is something that we have to address, and we're very lucky to have a very expert panel to discuss this issue. And from right to left is Dr. Alia Brahimi. She's a director at Contest Global, a strategic intelligence firm. Alia has held several academic posts at Oxford and the LSE. She also holds a PhD from Oxford in international relations that looked at Al-Qaeda. Alia also, you may recognize, she appears regularly in the news media, and she's also the author of a book entitled Jihad, A Just War in the War on Terror. Alex Webster, a lot of you may also recognize, as he's been involved with the Next Century Foundation for many years and is a good friend of the foundation. He is a freelance documentary maker, and his expertise for this panel is he helped make a documentary with Louis Theroux on IS in the UK, and also has done investigative documentaries on Islamist extremism here in the UK. And to my left is Alex Krasodomski-Jones, who is a researcher of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, and his primary area of research interest is political extremism and its reportage on social media. And he has some very, very interesting ideas on how we can challenge ISIS or Daesh, certainly in the area of their spread of propaganda. So if I could maybe set the scene, I'll just give one quote and then hand over to Dr. Alia Brahimi. But I just wanted to set the scene by quoting Joseph Conrad, who said, "If terrorism is going to be truly effective, it must be directed against the spirit of the age." And with no further ado, Dr. Alia Brahimi.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, is that working? Yeah. So I assume that my task is to do a little bit of scene setting, and that then you'll hear from the real experts. My headline point is going to sound a little bit polemical, and I hope that's not too distasteful. But in my humble experience, many roads of inquiry into the ideology that we're now confronted by wind their way back to the Iraq War. And it's important to recognize this, I believe. In particular, two main features. And I think the first is the way in which the Iraq War and its effects fundamentally changed the nature of radical Islam, which became, in Iraq, a state-building enterprise. So this was driven by the participation of ISIS and its predecessor groups in the insurgency and the tactical alliances that they probably formed with former Ba'athist officials who knew a lot about building strong chokehold states. And I believe that this state-building model has had a dramatic impact on jihadist ideas and actors and spaces, and that social media tools are connecting these changing ideas and actors and spaces like never before. And in terms of ideas and ideology, it's led to an obsession with local enemies. I'll return to this, but In order to run a functioning state and maintain control over local people, you have to continually instill fear. And this has led to an ever more fanatical and intolerant jihadist discourse, where we're at the stage where they don't even bother to engage almost with the Islamic just war tradition in the way that Al-Qaeda did. Actors have also changed. We all know about the scale of foreign fighter flows. That's well known and well reported on. But beyond the fighters who physically join ISIS, its territorial vision of jihad and the notion of the caliphate has enabled its sympathizers worldwide to conceive of themselves as soldiers waging war on behalf of a state, a tangible community, rather than as lone actors carrying out terrorist acts in the service of a more ill-defined end, as was the case with Al-Qaeda. And so with Omar Mateen, the Orlando shooter, he's no longer then a sexually conflicted and psychologically disturbed hater, but rather a soldier waging war on behalf of a state. And spaces have changed too. ISIS, as you know, ISIS and its provinces don't merely seek to exploit chaos, but also through the establishment of states to impose a long-term order. So jihadist spaces are not only geographically expanding from Borno State in Nigeria to Baghlan province in Afghanistan, from the Mindanao Islands in the Philippines to Maqalla in Yemen, but they're also systematically deepening. So my point is that this trend of state building emerged in many ways from the Iraq War. And the second significant outcome of that war and its impact on the evolution of ISIS ideology is the marked sectarian environment which followed the invasion, from the changed regional balance of power in favor of Iran to the wholesale disenfranchisement and brutalization of the Sunni population almost overnight. And so significant was this sectarian dynamic, which suddenly thrust communal difference to the fore, that it was seen as a very new and exciting opportunity for ISIS's leaders and predecessors, and it deeply informed their military and political strategy. So after 2003, they saw enormous strategic opportunity for themselves in sectarian war among local people, essentially to provoke the Shia into battle and the state into oppression, which would then awaken and galvanize a natural support base. And alongside these changes that are informed in many ways by the invasion of Iraq, we've seen two key ideological developments. And the first is the vision of society. With the gradual localization of jihad, which began in Iraq after 2003, you see an obsession with local enemies, what I term in my work the nearer enemy, elements of impure society, Shias, Yazidis, Christians, homosexuals, insufficiently devout Sunnis. And the second key ideological change is the vision of history. And that's the very powerful eschatological component, the millenarian strain, which pushes to the fore the view of violence as hastening a new world and a new millennium, and it connects slaughter and devastation to the return of the Mahdi, the Redeemer. So I began by suggesting that policy options and human choices have led in important ways to the rise of ISIS, that there's a deep interconnection between our policy and their policy, and that this strategic misstep is compounded every day in Iraq and Syria by authoritarian governments whose actions and policies drive the problem of jihadism, because ideas ultimately only enable jihadist leaders to recruit and justify what they do. They don't meaningfully drive the phenomenon, in my view. Political conditions do. And the point of this recognition that policy is linked to ideology is not to weigh in on a political debate or to encourage anger or despondency, but rather optimism. The struggle is as much about what we do as what they do. There's a dynamic at play. Every day in the campaign against ISIS, there are a host of factors that our representatives and our allies and our governments can control. And in our politics and our diplomacy and our humanitarian responses, we have to do a lot better. And I think that begins with the recognition that ISIS is fundamentally a political problem that has to be challenged with better political conditions, legitimate political authority, and not solely military hardware. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex.
Hello. So I'm just going to start talking really about how my area of expertise affects this. Last year I spent 5 months following around ISIS supporters in this country. You will doubtless know who they might be. Now I've just noticed that this is being filmed, so I won't name names because they're currently on trial for the crime of inciting support for a banned organisation, and as such, to name that, the current state of them is sub judice, which is also why we had to stop making our film. There would have been a really great Louis Theroux film about these people, but unfortunately that's not there anymore. So anyway, let's move on. Dr. Brahimi touched on the ISIS ideology, which I think is very interesting and is worth going into in a little bit of detail. So what do ISIS actually believe? Well, they believe they're at war. Dr. Brahimi touched on the eschatological aspect of this. It's essentially a Quranic version of the Book of Revelations, the end of the world, which they believe will take place in the year 2076. They believe that there will only be 12 righteous caliphs of the Muslim people, of which al-Baghdadi is number 8. All of the others have been false pretenders to this throne. Obviously, you might know the first 4, Abu Bakr, Omar, Ali, and Uthman. Got that right. I don't know who the 5 to 7 are. Presumably they're there in history somewhere. And they believe that when this final battle happens, it will begin in the town of Dabiq in northern Syria, which is why ISIS expended lots of military resources to capture this small, strategically insignificant town, why they've used it as location for some of their prominent beheading execution videos. Now, who should the caliph be? It has to be somebody of whole body, which would rule out Mullah Omar. I'm talking in jihadist terms, please don't let me tar the whole religion in this, because Mullah Omar only has one eye. It also has to be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, which would say rule out bin Laden from this claim, because as he descends from Yemen, it isn't something that he can convincingly claim. Now, when ISIS began to expand their territory, lots of ideologues within their organization started saying and started referring to these prophecies that they've been talking about for some time, saying, look, these conditions are being met for a caliphate. And in some ways, Baghdadi was kind of forced to adopt this mantle. In a sense, he was told by the ideologues, you know, you better claim this or we're not going to support you anymore. And what will that caliphate look like? Well, it will essentially try to take over the entire world in war once the flags against them reach 80, which they believe will refer to 80 different nations. So every nation that joins in the war against them, they say, oh, great, we're kind of getting up to the magic number of 80. If you watch any of their videos, which you must never do, because it will incredibly difficult images to get out of your mind. But there are some that are made using very slick graphics, infographics in fact, that just say what they think, what's going to happen, and what they're going to do. It's amazing, really. You know, I'm a filmmaker myself, and I think, gosh, you know, could I get a shot like that? Their focus is really tight. You know, this is very professionally done. So, what's it going to look like when ISIS falls apart? Well, I think we need to look towards something like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which used to control significant territory and now does not due to the actions of the Somali government and the international coalition. And once that happened, we saw a return to the more sporadic acts of extreme violence, such as, well, the most notable one being the Kenyan shopping mall shooting. I think we could expect more of that from ISIS. I think we will expect more attacks like Paris, which is most likely to have been carried out with some operational knowledge of the organization, as opposed to Orlando, which was a sexually repressed mental young man who'd also claimed adherence to groups like Hezbollah in the past. So, what are they like in this country? Well, the people I met included all sorts, religious people who were originally Christian or Hindu, who then converted to Islam. However, they converted under the guise of the ISIS recruiters, who, as I said, shall remain nameless. They have a very weak understanding of their religion. I sat in some Quranic classes taken by these people, and was surprised at how the emphasis is completely on war. Those are the Quranic verses that they go for. And that's very important, because Islam does have special provisions for when your community is at war. Now, that is one thing when you're a small community in the deserts of Arabia, expanding or contracting in relation to other groups and tribes. But when there's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, it's inconceivable to think that some of them aren't being oppressed at one point or another. Ultimately, it's a very sad fact, but I'm sure there are some Muslims being oppressed around the world right now, and that's going to remain. It's simply a question of numbers. Given that, they will always promote these images, these stories, these harrowing tales. It's very much a question of grievance. There are plenty of Twitter feeds, Facebook pages, websites that simply just one after the other show images of horrific violence that has been perpetrated against the Muslim, be it in Central Africa, be it in Pakistan, be it in the UK, be it wherever. And these fertile young minds see these images day after day after day, and they conclude, we're under attack. We have to do something. And the way that ISIS support was justified, without actually saying the words, which is illegal to say in this country, would be, well, as far as I can see, there's only one person really looking after the interests of Muslims, and for that would be Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now, having said that, sounds very worrying, but I wouldn't worry too much, because we have to understand that this is a very small group. Out of the sort of 2 to 3 million Muslims in this country, I'd say this network only extends to 200 or 300 people. It has a very strong branch in Luton for some reason, and then the most numerous is obviously London. There are sort of branches in Cardiff, Birmingham, Leeds, and they all know each other. They're all the same people. They've all got each other on the phone. It's a small network, and all roads lead to them. So it's important to also make the point that when the issue of radicalization first came up after 9/11, everyone was thinking, this is happening in the mosque, it's happening in the mosque. It's not. It's not happening in the mosque. It's happening in their own small groups, and it's happening online. But with the online aspect, you also have the self-radicalizers. And often when it comes to converts, these might be people who were former drug addicts, people who had real problems in their life, and finally they have something to cling to. And when they're at the most vulnerable, that is when the extremist ideologies seem most attractive, and when people take advantage of them. So, that all sounds very heavy. What are the solutions? Well, I wax lyrical on this sometimes. I think about it. I hang about with these guys a lot. And, you know, the weird thing is some of them are really nice. They're nice to be around. You know, any kind of ideologue who could bring a lot of people together, they're going to have a natural level of charisma. In between telling me how the steeds of war will crush the enemies of Islam, we ate strawberries and talked about the countryside. And I don't think that you're going to find the real long-term solution by simply making what they say illegal, which is the current reaction now. Part of that is because I'm personally a free speech absolutist or First Amendment advocate, although we don't have that in this country. And I feel that allowing speech out to be ridiculed is the most effective way of inhibiting it. You know, they were having a lot of trouble with the idea of having someone like Louis Theroux talk to them, because Louis, if you've seen any of his documentaries, is absolutely brilliant at deconstructing people, making them look a little bit foolish if they have foolish things to say, particularly in his earlier career. And they were worried. They didn't want ridicule. They want Jeremy Paxman or Fox News or whatever to bash them on the head and say, well, you believe this, well, you believe that. What they don't want is someone just to listen to them and say, that's absurd, but what about this? And point out the internal inconsistencies. The other reason I think that making that speech illegal wouldn't work is that the moment you make something illegal, it gives it the power of the unsaid. It's hidden power. It's as if this language and just this string of verbs and nouns and adjectives somehow has a kind of magical force. And when you're dealing with people who are talking about holy prophecies coming to pass, that is exactly what they will think of these rules. And they'll say, look, it's in the prophecy that these things would be forbidden by the ruling powers of the time. It's also worth saying, just before I forget, my two favorite prophecies of the ISIS ideologues. One is that the end of the world will come when those who herd camels build towers that reach the sky, and when the men begin to look like women, which might have sounded a bit mad in the 8th century, but when you consider that they are building very tall towers in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, and when you consider that in the West there is an active transgender movement or a homosexual rights movement, then that's the message they're going to take from it. And how should we respond in the West, those of us who aren't Muslims? Well, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of challenging this ideology based on their own religion. I'm not a Muslim, and who am I to arbitrate in a discussion between two people who are? And I think that any attempt to do so will be met with ridicule or bemusement, or at worst hostility. I think this is a discussion that should be had elsewhere and not by politicians in this country. So I'll just end on one thing, because I've rambled on for quite a bit. Just to move the conversation along a little bit, if you were to look at 1930s images that the Nazis produced in Germany, it looks ridiculous to us. These weird archaic types of lettering, these weird turns of phrase, Arbeit macht frei and all that. Now, to us that's ridiculous, but we're not German. And any kind of British fascism would appeal to things that we hold dear. Fascism wraps itself up in the history and the beliefs and the values of the culture in which it comes. And I think that what we're seeing right now is an explosion brought about by a very weak governance in that area, which Dr. Beebe touched on. And it's wrapped itself up in the values and the ideas and the stories of that culture. And on an optimistic note, I think, we've done a lot to rout out fascism in this country, in this culture, and I think it's only a matter of time before the same happens elsewhere. Thanks.
And now Alex Krasodomski-Jones is going to explore ISIS and their online activities and how they recruit people online.
Yeah, can I stand up? Is that okay?
Yeah.
No one minds. All right. Have you even brought some technology? Because I'm only talking about technology. Look at that. Hello, my name's Alex, which didn't make it onto the the label. I have one name there, like Pele or Ronaldo. My name's Alex. I'm a researcher at Demos, which is a think tank in central London, and it's been kicking around for 20 years or so, and we've looked at all kinds of policy, from pensions to housing to alcoholism and radicalisation. And about 4 years ago we started something called CHASM, which stands for the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media, but broadly speaking we are interested in the online world, the internet. When it first appeared, we thought, well, this will be a fantastic way of studying the kinds of things that we're already interested in, but also it will have its own impact, it will have its own policy implications, and in fact the internet will have its own impact on the way that we behave, our culture, our society, our politics, and indeed on radical groups. And obviously nowhere has this been clearer than with the rise of Islamic State. Not just what the message is, but how is that message delivered? I've written here the digital pathogen, which I don't think is particularly helpful, but you get the idea. Now, it's absolutely true that Islamic State have a sophisticated media strategy. We've already heard a little bit about that, the quality of their propaganda, the messages of their propaganda, the people it's targeted at. One thing we shouldn't make a mistake about is that technologically these guys are no great shakes. They have a digital output that is using social media platforms. Like very many young people use social media platforms today. They send one email, they send 100 emails. They send one tweet, they send 100 tweets. Their so-called encrypted messaging apps that keep their communication secret are all available to everybody else here. There is no Silicon Valley in Raqqa that we have to somehow blow up in order to help stop this technological advance. The Islamic State online is only an evolution in as much as the whole world, it's only a reflection of the way that we communicate these days ourselves. And blowing ISIS up in Syria and Iraq, even defeating ISIS entirely, is not going to change that. Nevertheless, we have seen a move towards social media. Now, there are loads of definitions of social media, ranging from the very boring to the very basic, like, for example, engage, share, enjoy, and the rest of it. But for the purposes of these next 10 minutes, I'm going to propose an alternative definition. And that is that social media is a platform, a place where people can go to share content and talk to each other that is too big to administrate. It's too big to control. That is where Facebook and Twitter and all these other platforms have made their money, had their huge success, is that they've unleashed a beast that they can't possibly control. There is a tradition when you talk about social media that you have to think of some new metaphor to describe how much conversation is being had on there, how many messages are being sent, how many emails are being sent. You have to think of something new and exciting. I don't know, there's 6 New Testaments being sent on one platform a day, and then there's this number of different. I don't have that, so I've got this. This is 10 seconds in the world of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 social media platforms. These are the number of messages that are being sent across those platforms. So 8, 9, 10. So we end up, broadly speaking, about 10 million messages over that period that I was speaking there. Now that's just private messages, so we don't necessarily have to worry about that. That's Edward Snowden's previous employers who can worry about doing that. But the content, the messages that the Islamic State and other groups are using, the platforms that are using, are far beyond anything you could possibly look to try to administrate. What have we got there? Well, I don't even know what that top number is, but it's an awful lot. Even if it's 1,000 million. Is that billion? At least in English, in old money. In old money. 33 billion messages being sent every day. I mean, how on earth can you begin to read that 33 billion communiques? Mission impossible. But that hasn't stopped people trying. This is an artist's impression of a social media company administration team. Hundreds of, there are around, well, estimates place it recently around 100,000, if not more, people whose job it is, usually in the Philippines or in India, to administrate these platforms and to look after them for us, so that when we or our parents log on to their platform. They don't see an ISIS beheading video. They see a message from their friends. This, by the way, does sound like one of the worst jobs in the world. You're paid a tiny amount of money to spend your entire day looking at the very worst content that the internet has to offer, removing it from a website only for somebody else to then put that content back onto the website. Pretty thankless and futile. So what solution might we have to this? We have a problem, right? We have a problem. We have the internet, which has grown up over the last 20, 30 years or so, and it's turned into a tool whereby radical messages can spread. Is there a solution? Well, the first solution was to try to administrate it manually. I've already said, how on earth do you manually administer 33 billion messages being sent every day? It's impossible. And also these networks, contrast isn't very good, but the networks of these groups are extremely resilient. Islamic State are quite good at if you knock out one account, they'll just grab another one. There's a message being sent from one Islamic State supporter who had his account suspended, and he said, "Oh, I've been knocked out again. I've created a new one. Can you guys share it so I can join the conversation again?" There's a badge of honor to some of this. I've been suspended 70 times. Here's account number 71. So we can't do it manually. Perhaps we can do it automatically. This is a lovely quote from Nicky Morgan. We need to censor. We need to automatically censor content that is linked to radical Islam. I don't know if you can see that. The quote at the bottom: Mrs. Morgan said that some pupils had been able to access information about so-called Islamic State at school. God forbid. This is no solution, and I can't really go into why, but it's to do with the fact that the way that we use language is incredibly complicated and it changes all the time. And so having a single filter that prevents us accessing content about Islamic State, or indeed anything, is going to be, it's far too clumsy. And it basically, in trying to protect the children, to think of the children, we end up blocking off vast quantities of the internet to them, while still not particularly preventing the content that we were looking to stop in the first place. But perhaps there's a better way. The second thing you hear is that, you guys working at these internet companies are all clever or nerdy, you look like that. Surely you can think of some computer program that can stop this content coming through. Now, leaving aside the question of whether we want a Californian social media company deciding what isn't a terrorist threat to the United Kingdom, the magic algorithm, the computer program that spots this content does not exist. As I've said before, the way that we use language makes this an almost impossible task for a computer to do, to sift through all of this information and find just those messages that constitute radical terrorist messages, or radical messages full stop. Spotting one, it's needle in haystack, but it's not really needle in haystack. Computers are dead good at spotting needles in haystacks because a needle is made of metal and a haystack is made of straw. This is much closer to trying to find a very specific piece of straw in a haystack. Why is it not called a straw stack then? Oh, never mind. And even if we were to remove them from from one of these social media platforms, they'll just go somewhere else. They have no problem about switching platforms. We call it a multi-platform zeitgeist, the ability that as soon as they are shifted from one platform, they'll just go and use another. We have a strategic win, or a tactical win, but we don't stop the messages going through. I think I'm running out of time.
Okay.
So what can we do? Let me just sum up. 3 ideas. Site design. I dropped this because I didn't think it was particularly interesting, so we'll just jump to the next one. Community powers. First thing is, you don't want an administration team. You need to involve the community online in trying to fight this. If you see something, say something, and then, and even better, if you see something, have the power to then remove it from online. Don't just have a group of people who are responsible with this. Make it a responsibility of the community. 2, counter-speech. If you're in a position where you see something you disagree with, if you can engage with that and have an argument with somebody about it in a public sphere, perhaps as members of an online community, we have a responsibility to do that and engage with this content. And finally, education. I think we need to teach young people to be more skeptical about what they see online. This is a skill that is desperately lacking among young people these days. If, when they see something on the screen, they don't immediately think that it is a true reflection of reality, absolutely that will be a vital skill in trying to fight propaganda, but it's fundamental all the way through young people's lives now. You know, many kids are on the internet long before they're in the playground now. And they can see that the propaganda that they see is, you know, a video showing how wonderful life is in Raqqa may not be an actual reflection of the truth. The 9/11 conspiracy nut job who explains how it couldn't have possibly been planes that smashed into those towers, it was a missile. Maybe he doesn't have a point. Maybe the photos of your children's friends that they see on Facebook aren't a true reflection of the lives they live. Maybe the pornography that they're watching isn't an accurate reflection of the sex that is, well, sex will stop. If we can teach young people to be more skeptical about what they see online, I think that would be a vital first step in trying to counter ideologies of this nature and radical ideologies more broadly.
I think we've been given a lot of food for thought there. Shall I start by just asking the panel, and Alex Webster touched on this, the idea of the caliphate. And obviously we're hearing every day now how ISIS are losing territory. Can Alex and maybe Dr. Brahimi expand a bit on the loss of territory? How will that impact on ISIS's ideology? Is that going to have something that obviously we could use in the counter-narrative?
Well, so one of the key messages that ISIS put forward in the online output that Alex has helpfully told us about is the tagline remaining and expanding. Baqiya wa Tamhidiya. My Arabic isn't very good anymore. And so in that sense, yeah, territory does back up their claims, and it is used to underline their primacy for domination on this earth. And if the fact is, if they're not remaining and they're not expanding, I think that is a powerful, counter-narrative that you can push there. The issue is, who does the pushing, really. I think it's up to media and civil society, because anything that comes from any official channel will instantly be regarded as dubious by the target audience.
And Dr. Brahimi, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, they are losing territory, significant amounts in Iraq, some in Syria. They've been pushed out of eastern Libya and now central Libya around Sirte. I think the main short-term ideological impact that we'll have is that we'll see more of a focus on justifying and providing a narrative around attacks in the West. Because, for someone interested, particularly in the way that they justify violence against the West, we've had relatively little fodder for that, because they've been focused on their local campaigns and their local ambitions, and the West has almost been put in parentheses for a long time now. So I think that, as a resort to becoming more of a traditional terrorist group, then we're going to see much more ideological work on why it's justified to take a handgun and spray it into a crowd of families and women and children in any Western city.
And now I'm going to open it up to the floor.